Something is happening right now in the Middle East that a lot of people are still reading the wrong way. The official story coming out of Washington is simple. The strikes were overwhelming. Iran has been hit hard. Its military capacity is being broken down piece by piece. The White House is openly saying that American forces are systematically dismantling Iran's ability to threaten the United States, its allies, and global security. And on the surface, that sounds like a familiar story of air power, dominance, and control. But that may not be the real story at all. Because while that message is being broadcast from the top, oil has surged back above $100 a barrel. Gulf shipping is under repeated attack, and one of the most important energy choke points on Earth has become so dangerous that even discussing how to reopen it now sounds less like logistics and more like war planning. This is not just a battlefield story anymore. This is a system story, a shipping story, an insurance story, an inflation story, a global pressure story. And the deeper implication is brutal. Iran may be losing in the sky while still finding ways to make the entire world pay for the war below. That is the contradiction at the center of this crisis. The first phase of the war was about firepower. The second phase may be about blowback, about whether a country under enormous military pressure can shift the battlefield from missiles and bomb damage to shipping lanes, energy nerves, and market fear. Read that again. Not winning the war in the conventional sense. Making the cost of continuing the war so high that the meaning of victory starts to rot from the inside. If you are watching oil, shipping, inflation, or geopolitics, that is the real line to follow. Because the story now is not only whether Iran can keep fighting, it is whether the United States and its partners can keep claiming control while emergency measures pile up all around them. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time, because this is one of those moments where the headlines look fragmented, but the underlying pattern is one single escalating structure. Go back to February 28th. The war begins with US and Israeli strikes on Iran. Within days, the White House is presenting the campaign as a display of crushing dominance. That is the public posture. But from the very beginning, the United Nations was warning that the conflict could ignite something much wider across the region. In an Emergency Security Council meeting on February 28th, Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned of a wider Middle East conflict and called for restraint and a return to talks. Then, on March 11th, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2817 condemning Iran's attacks on neighbouring states as the violence spiralled. So even before this latest wave of market panic, the international system was already signalling that this was not a neat military operation with clean edges. It was a regional escalation risk with open-ended consequences. That matters, because one of the oldest mistakes in war is to confuse tactical success with strategic stability. Bombing can be precise. Shock can be real, damage can be severe, and still, the actual trajectory of the war can be moving in the opposite direction. Now look at what happened next. According to the Associated Press, Iran's latest strikes have hit shipping traffic and energy infrastructure across the Gulf, pushing oil back above $100 a barrel with no clear end to the war in sight. AP reports that Iran struck a container ship off Dubai, caused a blaze near Bahrain's airport, targeted a major Saudi oil field with a drone, and forced Iraq to halt operations at all of its oil terminals after attacking Basra port. Let that sink in. This is not symbolic retaliation. This is a deliberate move against the connective tissue of the regional economy. The logic appears straightforward. If Iran cannot reverse the military balance directly, it can still raise the strategic cost of the war by threatening the flow of oil, freight, confidence, and regional normalcy. That is why this crisis matters far beyond the Gulf, because when shipping and energy infrastructure become part of the target set, the war stops being contained to combat zones. It starts bleeding into every country that depends on stable energy flows and predictable sea lanes. And now we get to the hardest point for many people to process. The Strait of Hormuz does not need to be formally sealed, legally blockaded, or physically stuffed with sunk ships to become functionally unusable. It only needs to become terrifying enough. The Strait of Hormuz remains the world's most important oil transit choke point. According to the US Energy Information Administration, flows through the strait averaged 20.9 million barrels a day in the first half of 2025, equal to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption and 1/4 of total global maritime traded oil. Very few alternatives exist if that artery is disrupted. So the real threshold is psychological and commercial, not merely geographic. Once ship owners fear the passage, once crews fear the passage, once insurers or war risk underwriters treat the passage like a death trap, the map may still show an open lane while the market behaves as if it is closed. That is how modern choke points break, not only through law or naval declarations, but through concentrated fear inside a narrow corridor the world cannot easily replace. That is exactly why the AP reporting on Hormuz is so important. Naval experts told AP that sending warships or civilian vessels into the strait before hostilities end would be extraordinarily dangerous, with one retired French admiral describing it as suicidal in the current context. AP's reporting says reopening the waterway safely in the short term is a huge challenge, not only because of missiles, drones, fast attack craft and mines, but because shipping confidence has already been shattered. Another report carried by Al Jazeera, based on AP and Reuters, says France and its partners are preparing a defensive escort mission for tankers and container ships once the most intense phase of the conflict ends. Read the timing carefully. Once the most intense phase ends. Not now. Later. That tells you almost everything. If major powers are talking about a post-intense phase escort architecture, they are effectively admitting that the route is too dangerous to normalise under current wartime conditions. That is not what battlefield control looks like. That is what strategic hazard looks like. And here is where it gets worse. Once a choke point like Hormuz becomes functionally impaired, the consequences do not stop at oil. They spread outward through insurance contracts, rerouting decisions, freight delays, inventory strategies, and risk pricing. Shipping does not move on slogans. It moves on confidence, on actuarial assumptions, on whether a company believes a tanker can pass safely enough to justify the voyage. Reports over the past week have shown traffic collapsing and commercial hesitation deepening as attacks mounted and the risk environment deteriorated. Even where insurance has not vanished entirely, the issue is that safety and cost have become so distorted that the practical result is paralysis. And paralysis in a place like Hormuz is a global event. Every refinery planner, every commodities trader, every airline fuel buyer, every government finance ministry understands what that means. A war that was sold as a decisive blow against one state is now threatening the pricing architecture of the world economy. That is the contradiction. That is the hidden reversal. Then came one of the clearest signals yet that the crisis had already escaped the battlefield narrative. The International Energy Agency agreed to the largest release of emergency oil reserves in its history in an effort to counter the shock to energy markets from the Iran war and the effective halt of cargo shipping through Hormuz. AP describes it as the biggest such release the agency has ever coordinated. Other reporting says the package is around 400 million barrels, more than double the 2022 release after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with the United States contributing heavily from its strategic petroleum reserve. Now stop there for a moment. Governments do not reach for record emergency stock releases because everything is under control. They do it because the market is showing signs of systemic strain. Emergency reserves are not propaganda. They are damage control. They are what states use when they need to buy time, restore confidence, and convince traders that the worst-case supply shock can still be managed. And that changes the meaning of the war politically. Because if the public is being told that the enemy is being crushed, while behind the scenes the world's wealthy states are organising their biggest emergency oil release on record, something is off. The words and the behaviour are diverging. The message says dominance. The mechanism says containment. The statement says victory is advancing. The response says the system is bracing for a prolonged supply disruption. That does not mean the White House is lying about damage inflicted on Iran. Iran has plainly taken severe blows. But it does mean the strategic picture is much uglier than a clean triumph narrative suggests. A state can be bombed heavily and still impose enormous second-order costs through geography, asymmetric capability, and market psychology. That is what many people miss when they talk about wars like this as if they are simple scoreboards. They are not scoreboards. They are pressure systems. And pressure systems do not care who won the press conference. Step back for a moment and look at the wider chessboard. One of the reasons this story is so dangerous is that it does not stay in the Gulf. AP is already reporting that US-mediated talks related to the war in Ukraine are on hold because of the Iran war. President Zelensky said Ukraine is still awaiting White House approval for a major drone production agreement, while also noting that the Middle East conflict might push Washington's calculations in new directions. AP further reports that Russian oil revenue during this Middle East conflict has averaged 14% higher than in February because of the rise in crude prices. That is a major second-order effect. A war that destabilizes energy markets can end up boosting the revenue stream of another adversary in another theatre. In other words, the Middle East shock does not merely distract from Europe's biggest war since World War II. It may also indirectly improve Moscow's financial position at a critical time. This is how strategic overload begins, not as a dramatic declaration, as a series of linked pressures that drag attention, money, and urgency away from one front and into another. Europe's response also reveals something important. France is already talking about a future defensive escort mission to gradually reopen Hormuz once the most intense phase subsides. That means Europe is not looking at this as someone else's regional firefight. It is treating it as a direct threat to freedom of navigation and maritime security. Why? Because once a choke point carrying around 1/5 of the world's oil is destabilized, Europe, Asia, and the global financial system all feel the pressure. Even countries not directly involved in the strikes must begin planning for naval deployments, contingency energy measures, and the political fallout of higher prices. This is where wars become larger than the claims made for them at launch. They stop being about the initial target set and start becoming about alliance bandwidth, global supply resilience, and how many simultaneous shocks the Western system can absorb without losing focus or cohesion. Iran may not be able to win conventionally against the coalition hitting it, but it may still be able to widen the field of pain enough to expose the coalition's limits. So what does this mean for ordinary people watching from far outside the Gulf? It means the bill for this war does not stay in the Middle East. It arrives through fuel prices, freight costs, inflation anxiety, market volatility, and policy reactions. If oil stays elevated, transport gets more expensive. When transport gets more expensive, food distribution, manufacturing inputs, aviation, logistics, and consumer goods all feel the pressure. Central banks notice, governments notice, employers notice, households notice. Even people who never look at a map of the Gulf can end up paying for what happens there through a more expensive commute, pricier goods, weaker business confidence, or a slower economy. That is why Hormuz matters so much. It is not just a narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman. It is a lever attached to the daily life of millions of people who have never heard a naval warning in their lives. And once that lever is pulled, the distance between war zone and kitchen table becomes much shorter than most people think. From here, there are two plausible paths. The first is a de-escalation path, and it is still possible. Under that scenario, outside powers push hard for a pause or ceasefire. Gulf attacks slow. Naval escort planning turns into a temporary stabilization framework, and insurers gradually regain enough confidence for commercial traffic to resume in something like a controlled way. Emergency oil stocks buy time, markets cool, and both sides claim enough success to step back from the edge. That path would not mean the war was wise. It would mean the blowback was contained before it became structural. The second path is darker. Iran continues to strike shipping and energy nodes intermittently, not necessarily to seal the strait permanently, but to keep risk elevated and costs high. Tanker traffic remains constrained. Insurance remains expensive. Oil remains volatile. Western governments stay trapped between military escalation and economic fire suppression, and the conflict mutates from a dramatic short war into a longer war of attrition against the world's tolerance for disruption. At that point, the question would no longer be whether Iran can defeat its enemies militarily. It would be whether it can keep poisoning the strategic environment long enough to turn their victory narrative against them. And that is why this moment matters so much. Because the deeper danger here is not simply that the war expands geographically, it is that it changes character. It begins as a campaign of punishment and denial. It evolves into a global test of resilience. Can energy markets remain stable? Can shipping remain credible? Can allies remain aligned? Can policymakers fight one war without empowering another adversary somewhere else? Those are much harder questions than whether a target was destroyed in a single night of strikes. The official story says Iran is being broken. The real story may be that Iran is trying to drag the global economy into the war with it, not by conquering anything, not by winning the sky, but by turning dependence itself into a weapon. And if that reading is correct, then what we are watching now is not the end of the crisis. It is the point where the crisis starts to reveal its true scale. So I want to leave you with 3 questions. If a war is sold as a decisive operation, but within days, governments are tapping record emergency reserves and planning future naval escorts just to restore basic trade, what does decisive really mean? If a choke point does not need to be formally closed for markets to treat it like a nightmare, where does real power now sit? In bombs and statements, or in fear and logistics? And if this conflict keeps driving oil higher, stalling other negotiations, and reshaping the strategic calendar far beyond the Middle East, who is actually absorbing the blowback of this war? Leave your answer in the comments, because this story is not over. It may just be entering its most consequential phase.